The event that woke me up was 30 student organizations came out with a public letter on October 8th, literally the morning after this letter was created, and said, Israel is solely responsible for Hamas's violent acts. Again, Israel had not even mounted a defense at this point, and there were still terrorists running around in the southern part of Israel. And I'm like, Harvard students, 34 Harvard student organizations signed this letter. And I'm like, what is going on? WTF, right? And that's when I went up on campus and I started talking to the faculty. And that's when I started hearing about, actually, Bill, it's this DEI ideology. I'm like, what? DEI, like diversity, equity, inclusion. I obviously I'm familiar with these words, and I see this in the corporate context. And they say, yeah, and they started talking to me about this oppressed framework, which is effectively taught on campus and represents the backdrop for many of the courses that are offered and the various some of the studies and other degree offerings. I'm like, I had not even heard of this, and I'm a pretty aware person, but I was completely unaware. And basically, they're like, look, Israel is deemed an oppressor, and the Palestinians are deemed the oppressed, and you take the side of the oppressed, and any acts of the oppressed to dislodge the oppressor, regardless of how vile or barbaric, are okay. I'm like, okay, this is a super dangerous ideology. And so I wrote a questioning post about this. I'm like, here's what I'm hearing. Is this right? And then I had a friend of mine sent me Christopher Rufo's book, America's Cultural Revolution, which is sort of a sociological study of the origins of the DEI movement and critical race theory. And I found it actually one of the more important books I've read. And also I found it quite concerning. And really, it's sort of ultimately DEI comes out of a kind of a Marxist, socialist backdrop way to look at the world. And so I think there are a lot of issues with it, but unfortunately it's advancing. I ultimately concluded racism as opposed to fighting it, which is what I thought it was ultimately about.
So maybe you can speak to that book a little bit. So there's a history that traces back across decades and then that infiltrated college campuses.
So basically what Rufo argues is that the Black Power movement of the 60s really failed. It was a very violent movement, and many of the protagonists ended up in jail. And out of that movement, a number of kind of thought leaders, this guy named Marcuse and others, built this framework, kind of an approach. He said, look, if we're going to be successful, it can't be a violent movement, number one. And number two, we need to infiltrate, if you will, the universities. And we need to become part of the faculty. And we need to teach the students. And then once we take over the universities with this ideology, then we can go into government, and then we can go into corporations, and we can change the world. So I thought important book. And the more I dug in, the more I felt there was credibility to this, not just the kind of sociological backdrop, but to what it meant on campus. And Harvard faculty were telling me that, there's really is no such thing as free speech on campus. And that, there was a survey done, a year or so ago, the Harvard faculty, and only 2% of the faculty admitted, even in an anonymous survey, admitted to having a conservative point of view. So we have a campus that's 98% non-conservative, liberal, progressive, that's adopted this DEI construct. And then I learned from a member of the search committee for the Harvard president that they were restricted in looking at candidates, only those who met the DEI office's criteria. And I shared this in one of my postings, and I was accused of being a racist. And that's someone who believes in that diversity is a very good thing for organizations, and that equity, fairness is really important, and having an inclusive culture is critical, for a functioning of an organization. So here I was, someone who was like, okay, DEI sounds good to me, at least in the small d, small e version of events, but this DEI ideology is really problematic.
So what's the way to fix this in the next few years? The infiltration of DEI with the uppercase version of universities and the things that have troubled you, the things you saw at Harvard and elsewhere.
In the same way, this was an eye-opening event for me. It has been for a very broad range of other people. I've never gotten, I mentioned General Growth. I got a lot of nice letters from people for making money on a stock that went up 100 times. But I literally get hundreds of emails, letters, texts, handwritten letters, typed letters from people from the ages of 25 to 85 saying, Bill, this is so important. Thanks for speaking out on this. You were saying what, so many of us believe but have been afraid to say. I described it as almost a McCarthy-esque kind of movement, and that if you challenge the DEI construct, people accuse you of being a racist. It's happened to me already. I'm perhaps, I'm much less vulnerable than a university professor who can get shouted off campus, canceled. I'm sort of difficult to cancel, but that doesn't mean people aren't going to try. And I've been the victim of a couple of interesting articles in the last few days, or at least one in particular in the Washington Post, written by what I thought was a well-meaning reporter. But it's just clear that I've taken on some big parts of at least the progressive establishment, DEI. I'm also a believer that Biden should have stepped aside a long time ago, and it's only getting worse. So I'm attacking the president, DEI, elite universities, and you make some enemies doing that.
But I should say I'm still at MIT, and I love MIT, and I believe in the power of great universities to explore ideas, to inspire young people to think, to inspire young people to lead.
Let me ask, okay, how can you explore how to think when you're only shared a certain point of view, right? How can you learn about leadership when the governance and leadership of the institution is broken, and exposure to ideas if you're limited in the ideas that you're exposed to? So I think universities are at risk. I mean, the concerning thing, right, is if 34 student organizations that each have, 30 members or maybe more, right, that's 1,000. Okay, that's a meaningful percentage of the campus, perhaps, that ultimately respond. Now, 10 or so of the 30 withdrew the statement once many of the members realized what they had written. So I don't think it seems like the statement was signed by the leadership and not necessarily supported by all the various students that were members. But if the university teaches people these precepts, this is the next generation of leaders. Normally, if you think about, I wrote my college thesis on university admissions. The reason why controlling, the gates of the Harvard institution, the admissions office is important, isn't that many of these people who graduate end up with, the top jobs in government, and ultimately become judges. They're permeate through society, and so it really matters what they learn. And if they're limited to one side of the political aisle, and they're not open to a broad array of views, and these represent some of the most elite institutions in our country, I think it's very problematic for the country long term.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And I also felt like the leadership wasn't even part of the problem as much as they were almost out of touch, like unaware that this is an important moment, it's an important crisis, it's an important opportunity to step up as a leader and define the future of an institution. So I don't even know where the source of the problem is. It could be literally governance structure, as we've been
Well, it's two
talking
things.
about.
I think it's governance structure. I also think universities are they're not selecting leaders.
Yeah.
It's not clear to me that universities should necessarily be run by academics, right? The dean of a university, the person who helps, there's sort of the business of the university, right? And then there's the academics of the university, and having I would argue having a business leader run these institutions, and then having a board that's involved, a board that has itself diverse viewpoints, and by the way, permanently structured to have diverse viewpoints, is a much better way to run a university than picking an academic that the faculty supports. Because, one of the things I learned about how faculty get hired at universities, ultimately it's signed off by the board, but the new faculty are chosen by each of the various departments. And once the departments tip, there's sort of a tipping point politically where once they tip in one direction, the faculty recruit more people like themselves. And so the departments become more and more progressive, if you will, with the passage of time, and they only advance candidates that match that meet their political objectives. It's not a great way to build an institution which allows for
small d diversity.
Allows for diversity, and diversity, by the way, is not just race and gender, and that's also something I feel very strongly about.
Well, luckily, engineering, robotics is touched last by this. It is touched, but when I'm at the computing building, Stata and the new one, politics doesn't infiltrate, or I haven't seen it infiltrate quite as deeply as elsewhere. But
it's in the biology department at Harvard, because biology is controversial now.
Yes.
Because biology and gender, there are faculty. There's a woman at Harvard who was literally canceled from the faculty as a member. I think she was at the med school, and she was, she made the argument that there are basically, two genders determined by biology. She wasn't allowed to stay.
Oh,
that's another topic for another time.
That's another topic.
You should do a show on that one. That'd be an interesting one.
So, as you said, technically, Claudine Gay, the president of Harvard, resigned over plagiarism, not over the thing that you were initially troubled by.
It's hard to really know, right? It's not like a provable fact. I would say at a certain point in time, she lost the confidence of the faculty, and that was ultimately the catalyst. And whether that was, how much of that was the plagiarism issue, and how much of that was some of the things that preceded it, or was it all of these issues in their entirety? There's no way to do a calculus.
Can you explain the nature of this plagiarism from what you remember?
So Aaron Sabarium and Christopher Rufo, one from the Free Beacon, and Chris, surfaced some allegations on or identified some plagiarism issues that I would say the initial examples were, use of the same words with proper attribution, some missing footnotes. And then over time, with, I guess, more digging, they released, I think, ultimately something like 76 examples of what they call plagiarism in, I think, 8 of 11 of her articles. And one of the other things that came forth here is, as president of the university, she had sort of the thinnest transcript academically of any previous president, very small, relatively small body of work. And then when you couple that with the amount of plagiarism that was pervasive, and then I guess some of the other examples that surfaced were not missing quotation marks, where the authors of the work felt that their ideas had been stolen. And really, plagiarism is academic fraud. There are indicia. One indicia of plagiarism is a missing footnote. That could also be a clerical error. And so when a professor is accused of plagiarism, the university does sort of a deep dive. They have these administrative boards, and it can take 6 months, 9 months, a year to evaluate, intent matters. Was this intentional theft of another person's idea? That's academic fraud. Or was this sloppy, you missed, or just humanity, right? You miss a footnote here or there. And I think once it got to a place where people felt it was theft of someone else's intellectual property, that's when it became intolerable for her to stay as president of Harvard.
So is there a spectrum for you between different kinds of plagiarism, maybe plagiarizing words and plagiarizing ideas and plagiarizing novel ideas?
Of course. The common understanding of plagiarism, if you look in the dictionary, it's about theft. Theft requires an intent. Did the person intentionally take someone else's ideas or words? Now, if you're writing a novel, right, words matter more, right? If you're taking Shakespeare and presenting it as your own words, if you're, writing about ideas, ideas matter, but you're not supposed to take someone else's words without properly acknowledging them, whether it's quotation marks or otherwise. But in the context of a academic's life's work before AI, everyone's going to have missing quotation marks and footnotes. I remember writing my own thesis. I would take, there were books you couldn't take out of Widener Library, so I'd have index cards, and I'd write stuff on index cards, and I put a little citation to make sure I remembered to cite it properly. And scrambling to do your thesis, get it in on time. What's the chances you forget at what point what are your words versus the author's words, and you forget to put quotation marks? Just the humanity, the human fallibility of it. So, you don't get, it's not academic fraud to have human fallibility, but it's academic fraud if you take someone else's ideas that are an integral part of your work.
Is there a part of you that regrets that, at least from the perception of it, the president of Harvard stepped down over plagiarism versus over refusing to say that the calls for genocide are wrong?
Again, I think it would have sent a better message if a leader fails as a leader, and that's the reason for their resignation or dismissal, then she gets, if you will, caught on a technical violation that had nothing to do with failed leadership. Because I don't know what lesson what's lesson that teaches the board about selecting the next candidate. I mean, the future of Harvard, a lot of it's going to depend on who they pick as the next leader. Here's an interesting anecdote that I think is not surfaced publicly. So a guy named Larry Bacow was the previous president of Harvard. Larry Bacow was on the search committee, and they were looking for a new president. And what was strange was they picked an old white guy to be president of Harvard when there was, a call for a more diverse president. And what I learned was Harvard actually ran a process, had a diverse new president of Harvard. And in the due diligence on that candidate shortly before the announcement of the new president, they found out that that presidential candidate had a plagiarism problem. And the search had gone on long enough, they couldn't restart a search to find another candidate. So they picked Larry Bacow off the board, off the search committee, to be the next president of Harvard as kind of an interim solution. And then there was that much more pressure to have a more diverse candidate this time around, because it was a big disappointment to the DEI office, if you will, and I would say to the community at large. That Harvard, of all places, couldn't have a racially diverse president. It would send an important message. So the strange thing is that they didn't do due diligence on President Gay, and that it was a relatively quick process. So the whole thing, I think, is worthy of further, exploration.
So this goes deeper than just the president.
Yes, for sure. When a company fails, most people blame the CEO. I generally blame the board, right? Because the board's job is to make sure the right person's running the company, and if they're failing, help the person. If they can't help the person, make a change. That's not what's happened here. The board's hand was sort of forced from the outside, whereas they should have made their own decision from the inside.
Do you still love Harvard?
Sure. It's a 400-odd year institution. It enormously helpful to me in my life, I'm sure. My sister also went to Harvard, and the experiences, learnings, friendships, relationships. Again, I'm very happy with my life. Harvard was an important part of my life. I went there for both undergrad and business school. I learned a ton, met a lot of faculty, a number of my closest friends who I still really keep in touch with. I made then. So yeah, it's a great place, but it needs a reboot.
Yeah, I still have hope. I think universities are really important institutions.
When I went to Harvard, there were 1,600 people in my class. I think today's class is about the same size. And their online education really has not sort of taken off, right? So I heard Peter Thiel speak at one point in time, and he's like, what great institution do you know that's truly great that hasn't grown in 100 years, right? The incentives in some sense of the alums are it's a bit like a club. If you're proud of the elitism of the club, you don't want any that many new members, but the fact that the population has grown of the country is so, significantly since certainly I was a student in 1984, and the fact that Harvard recruits people from all over the world, it's really serving a smaller and smaller percentage of the population today. And, some of our most talented and successful entrepreneurs anyway, it's a token of success that they didn't make it through their undergraduate years. They left as a freshman or they didn't attend at all.
For entrepreneurs, yes, but it's still a place.
Very important for research, very important for advancing ideas, and shaping dialogue and the next generation of Supreme Court justices.
Yes.
And, the members of government, politicians. So yes, it's critically important, but it's not doing the job it should be doing.